Welcome to chapter 17 on protection. So in this chapter, we'll primarily look at CPU protection, OS protection and file system protection. So we'll start with the main goals of protection. What are the key principles, particularly protection rings? Then we will talk about two main mechanisms. The first is access matrix based mechanisms and the second are capability based mechanisms for protection. And finally conclude with a few advanced aspects of protection, operating system protection. So the objectives of this chapter are as follows. The first is to discuss the goals and principles of protection in a modern computer system. Then discuss access matrix and capability based protection systems. And finally describe how protection mechanisms mitigate the risk of attacks. So what is the goal of protection? Well, in a protection model, we would like to protect objects, where object can either be hardware or a software object, from malicious attacks. So each object is identified by a unique name and it can be accessed by a well-defined set of operations. So the main aim over here is to ensure that each of these operations are protected in the sense that they are accessed correctly the way they are intended to be accessed, and they are also accessed by those processes that are allowed to do so. So what is the main principle of protection? Well, it's the principle of least privilege. So this means that be it any entity, a program, a user, a system, doesn't matter. It is given just enough privileges for it to perform its task and not more than that. So of course, if there is an attack, in the sense if there is a bug or if there is an external attack, if the permissions and the protections are set correctly, they will limit the extent of the damage. They are typically static in the sense during the lifetime of a system or during the lifetime of a session, they remain the same. But they can also be dynamic in the sense they can change if needed. For example, let's say that we want to switch a domain, go from a user mode to administrator mode, then we can escalate the privileges, we can increase what we have for some time. Then there is something else which is a related concept known as compartmentalization. So this is a derivative concept. This is regarding access to data. So this is basically the process of protecting each individual component. So we take every individual component of an operating system and then we provide very specific permissions and access restrictions. So in general, this is a generic mechanism. So this can be done at the level of individual components like files, for example, or it can be done at a larger unit like directories, for example. So there we can, in detail say who is allowed to do what, who is not allowed to do what. So a full list of do's and don'ts. So of course, this can be a pretty cumbersome exercise, particularly if we have a lot of users. But then that said and done, in many commercial systems, this level of protection is often required. So we should look at whether we are looking at like a rough grained privilege management. For example, if you look at Unix systems and Unix processes, so we have already discussed the notion of the user, the group and all. So this is fairly coarse grained in the sense that you don't have to specify a lot, you just set the user ID and the group ID of a file and the rest all is taken care of. And maybe some processes can be initiated by the user, some by the root. So root or the super user is a special user who has some more access to the resources of the operating system as opposed to a regular user. Fine-grained management can be far more complex and far more cumbersome from the point of view of system administrators and even users themselves. So we can have an access control. ACL is an access control list for a file. So we could have that, and then this could be specified in detail if there is a need, that is. The other mechanism is RBAC, which is also called role-based access control. So in role-based access control, what happens is that the access is not given at the level of individual users, but is given based on the role in the company. Like for example, managers can have a certain level of access control, senior managers can have a certain level of access control, vice president, and so on. Furthermore, we can make domains in the sense we can group users into sets and each set will have a certain level of permission. And of course, whatever is done, regardless of whoever is doing it, needs to be audited such that later on it can be analyzed in great depth, which means anytime we change the protection of any file, particularly, that needs to be recorded and audited such that we can catch things. And nowadays, of course, there are many machine learning based tools that can automatically analyze such audit trails and figure out if something is amiss. So if something is amiss, then immediately maybe the system administrator can be told that look, something is going wrong. So one of the key ideas in protection is the notion of a protection ring. So protection ring as such is a hardware concept. So what we do is that, let's say we have rings of this type like ring 0, ring 1, ring 2 and ring 3. So a ring is nothing but a register. So a ring is nothing but a hardware register. So if there are 4 rings, it's a 2-bit hardware register. Typically what happens is, if we don't have anything, so what is the hypervisor, I'll tell you later. But let's say that if we just have the operating system and we have a user application, then what can happen is that the operating system, let's say, can run in ring 0, which means that it will have accesses to all the devices and all the files. So anything running on ring 0 has the access to the maximum amount of hardware. Then of course we'll have ring 1, which is again another hardware concept. So maybe here in ring 0 you can access the BIOS, in ring 1 you cannot. Similarly, ring 2 will provide less and ring 3 will provide even less. So let us say that applications can run in ring 3 where they will not have access to a lot of instructions and a lot of hardware resources as well. All right. So of course, it is possible to transfer between levels. For example, when an application makes a system call, then the control automatically gets transferred to ring level 0, which is the ring of the operating system. All right. And traps and interrupts can do the same thing. Modern systems also have a specialized program called a hypervisor. So in this case, the hypervisor is a program that will run on ring 0, and the operating systems typically run in ring 1 or ring 2. So the hypervisor is like a super OS. In the sense, you would have typically seen programs such as VirtualBox or VMware, which allow you to run another operating system as a regular application, right? So what normally happens in modern systems is that on the CPU, we have a very thin operating system that is running. It's called the hypervisor. And the hypervisor furthermore runs a regular commercial operating system or a regular operating system like Windows and Linux on top of it. All right. So that is the key broad idea over here, that we run other operating systems on top of it. So these operating systems will run like applications. And of course, their powers with regards to hardware will be limited as opposed to the hypervisor. And the hypervisor will be discussed in a subsequent chapter. Furthermore, we can have dedicated secure hardware like ARM Trust Zone or Intel SGX, which can do secure actions, particularly in systems where we don't trust the kernel. For example, Intel SGX can be used to securely load a program and execute it, and the kernel will not be able to tamper with it. And furthermore, it is possible to send evidence to a third-party server that the kernel indeed has not tampered with the execution. So that is also possible with secure hardware. So as I said, the idea of protection rings is like this, that we can conceptually arrange them in this manner, where ring 0 runs with the highest privilege and gradually applications run at the outermost rings, which means that they have the least amount of privilege. And needless to say, the hierarchy is inclusive, which means that ring I, or let's say maybe the ring 5, can do whatever ring 6 can, but ring 6 cannot do everything that ring 5 can. So Android does use ARM's trust zone. So ARM trust zone is a mode of execution and also some additional hardware where applications can run securely, in the sense that what they are doing will not be visible to other processes, including the kernel. So any application that is in need of cryptographic services will use the COM Android application. Frameworks use vendor supplied hardware abstraction layer to communicate with a daemon. And so the hardware abstraction layer basically allows you to abstract the hardware such that you can communicate with the trust zone daemon. So then this is vendor supplied in the sense that whoever is supplying the chip that provides a privileged user mode daemon. So this issues a request to the trust zone driver via the kernel, and then the kernel basically sets up what is called a trust zone secure area or a secure region where the program can execute on a secure processor, and within the trust zone mode the program can execute securely. All right. So in this case, it is guaranteed that it can perform cryptographic operations without other processes and even the kernel for that matter seeing it. So the ARM CPU architecture is like this. So we have applications at the user level. They trap to the kernel, and if let's say hypervisor is running, which as I said is like a very thin layer of code whose job is to mainly run different OS kernels. So a modern hypervisor can run different OS kernels in parallel, right? So how do they exactly run? Well, we will see that in a later chapter. And then of course there will be a security monitor that will monitor all the activities of the hypervisors and the kernel. In addition, it is also possible to run a set of trusted applications in the secure mode, in the ARM trust zone mode. And in this process, what will happen is that whatever the process is doing will not be visible, and other processes also will not be able to tamper with the state of the secure process. So coming to the domain of protection, our main aim is that any computer can be treated as a set of processes and objects, where the hardware objects are the devices and the software objects are the files, programs, pipes, semaphores, etc. Any process from the principle of least privilege should have access to only those objects that it needs to access or needs to know about. It should not have more access than what is genuinely required. So as we have discussed before, any kind of a protection domain will basically have to specify all the resources that a process may access. These can be hardware resources or these could be software resources. So given a process, we either can have hardware resources or we could have software resources. Furthermore, the ability to execute an operation on an object is again an access right. So for given the object, we could have a set of access rights along with it. And furthermore, domains may share access rights, which can be either conferred to them statically or dynamically. This is something that we have discussed. So the access right as such is an object name and a set of rights, or a right set. So as you can see, let's say one domain gives the read write access to object 3, read write to order object 1, and execute access to object 2. Similarly, two domains can also have an intersection where the same right is kind of shared between two domains. This means that any user that is part of any of these domains D2 or D3 can issue this operation on object O4. So how is the domain implemented in Unix? So the domain is nothing but the user ID. So every user has a name but a unique user ID as well. And any kind of a domain switch is accomplished via the file system. So every file has associated with it a bit called the set UID bit. And when the file is executed, for example, the user ID is set to the actual owner of the file as per set UID if the set UID bit is on. Which means that by default, if I am creating a file and I am executing it, then I am the owner, right? But it is also possible to execute a file as somebody else, particularly if the set UID bit of the file is on. So in this case, I will be executing the file, but in the name of somebody else, that is if that somebody else has given me permission. So when I create a file, what I can do is I can give it permission by a mechanism called the sticky bit. And that basically means that when I'm executing the file, when anybody else is executing the file, that person would execute with my permissions. Furthermore, we can use the su command in Linux to shift from, let's say, one user to another user. So if I, let's say, do su username, this basically means that I want to log into the same system with the username of the other user. Along with that, I can always just run the su command like that, which means that I'll switch user, that is what su stands for, to the root. But there is also a command in Unix and Linux called sudo. So sudo basically says that if I have sudo access, I can run a command and the system will perceive it that the root is actually running the command. Because the root is the administrative user, is the most powerful user, is the super user in the Unix Linux world. So in every Unix Linux system, there is always a user called root, which has power over large parts of the file system and can, for example, change the kernel or load a new module of the kernel. So the root is like the owner. So even normal users can be given some access, in the sense that they can be given access to some programs, for example, where they can run it with root permissions. And the way to do this, other than set uid, is to actually use the sudo command. Android's protection works slightly differently. So distinct user IDs are provided, in this case, on a per application basis. So what happens is that when an application is installed, the installer itself provides it a distinct user ID, a group ID, along with a private data directory where it can keep its data, which is /data/app name, let's say. And the ownership is provided to this unique user ID group ID combination. So applications that are running on the device pretty much enjoy the same levels of protection that you would expect from a Unix system. And furthermore, it is possible to restrict the services of the kernel, or let's say any of the service, let it be networking or let it be the camera or anything, to a particular set of applications, right? So in this case, as I said, the idea is slightly different. The main reason being that in any server machine, multiple users typically log into the server. But in this case, in the case of Android particularly, it's not the case that multiple users use a phone, but we can think of each process as a user. Different processes, for example, can be accessing the camera or the networking subsystem at the same time. Consequently, they are our users. In this case, the process is the user. And we can say that for networking, only these processes are allowed to access, right? And the camera, these processes are allowed to access. All right. Furthermore, it is possible to define certain UIDs as isolated, which means that they will more or less not be able to do anything, right? Other than a very minimal access to services, they will more or less not be able to do anything at all. So now coming to the first mechanism, so we did talk about two mechanisms. So first is the access matrix and the other is the capability model. So let the rows represent the domains. So domain D1, D2, D3, D4, which are basically sets of users basically. And the columns represent the objects. So the object could be a file, a printer, it doesn't matter. And if, let's say, for a given row column pair, what really exists is the operations that the domain can execute on the object. So this is known as an access matrix, which is in itself a fairly simple concept. And this is stored within the security subsystem of the operating system. And here, this basically tells us which user can do what with which resource, and also the operations that it can run on them. So what is the use of the access matrix? Well, anytime a user of a certain domain or a process in a certain domain tries to access a certain object, then the access matrix can check if that operation is allowed or not. Okay. Furthermore, the access matrix can be modified. Particularly, the owner of an object can definitely modify the access matrix. And then permissions can be copied. And if, let's say, given domain has the permission to change access rights, it can do so. All right. And There is a fair amount of flexibility over here in the sense how the access matrix can be configured. In a sense, you can have, let's say, one very powerful domain like the root domain that can go and change all elements of this matrix. All right. Or you could have another process that can simply copy the permissions of one domain to the other. So there is a fair amount of flexibility that can be given to a system to access and modify the access matrix. So the access matrix, as you can see, is a reasonably simple concept. So what is the mechanism? Well, the mechanism is the operating system maintains the access matrix and the rule. Only authorized agents are allowed to manipulate the access matrix, and the creator of any object pretty much dictates the policy. So it dictates who are the other processes or other users that can access the given object. So what we can further do is that we can also have domains as objects, in the sense that if, let's say, I'm a user in domain 2, I can switch to domain 3. So I can also treat the domains as columns or objects, where of course what you will have is that it will just specify whether I can switch from one domain to the other or not. Furthermore, we can have an access matrix with copyrights, right? So as you can see, the star over here give the rights to copy. This basically means that domain 2 can copy the permission that it has for F2 to other objects as well. Similarly, we can also have an access matrix with owner rights, which can basically say that domain D2, for example, is the owner of F2. So we could add the owner information over here along with the permission copy information. So then, given the fact that we can sort of generalize this access matrix, there is a lot that operating systems do to actually store, maintain this access matrix. So it is generally a sparse matrix, the reason being that we have lots of objects and a lot of users. So it is not the case that we typically, for every user object pair, the access matrix will have an entry. So one option is that we can have a global table where we store ordered triples of the domain, the object, and the right set. So any requested operation M on object OJ with domain DI, all that you need to search is that you need to search for DI, OJ, and RK. So RK is the right set basically where you want the operation to be within RK. So if you are able to find such a triple, and let's say the operation you are requesting is within its right set, then there is no problem at all. The operation may be allowed. Unfortunately, this table can be very large and will not fit in main memory. And furthermore, to compress the table, we need to group objects. And for example, we might have one object that all domains can read. So in that case, we can omit a row of the access matrix. But in general, that's hard. It's not that easy to recognize such patterns and also do something about them. The other thing we can do is we can maintain access lists for objects. So every column, if you think about it in the access matrix, right? So if this is the access matrix and we have an object over here. So every column is like an access list for that object. So we can have, for every object, we can have a per object list, which will be ordered pairs of domain and right set, which basically is specifying all the domains and what they can do on them. So even if most of this is sparse, it can just maintain a linked list of all the domains that have some rights on it. All right. And of course, we can also have a default set, in the sense that if, let's say, I'm a member of some default domain, I will have access to this object. Okay. So, but the key point over here is that instead of storing the entire matrix, we can store it column wise. And in each column, we can omit the entries that are empty and only store those entries which are non-empty. So then in each column, as I said, we can store, if you want a more compact storage, we can store an access control list for each object. Let's say for object OJ, we only set those access matrix entries which are not empty. So basically they may correspond to domain 1, 2 and 3 like read, write, read and read. Every row is basically for a domain. So for a domain, if you look at every row of the access matrix, then it basically says that look for all the objects in the operating system, let's say from O1 to ON, what is it that you can do? Maybe some you can read, some you can read, write, some you can read, write and execute. So every row of the access matrix is known as a capability list. This is a very important concept. It needs to be borne in mind that every row of the access matrix is called a capability list. Why is it called a capability list? Because in a sense, it is specifying the capability of a domain. What exactly it can do in terms of all the objects that it can access. What exactly can it do in terms of reading, writing and executing, right? So the term capability list comes out of the access matrix. So the access matrix, if we split it column wise, then we can think of this as the access vector for a given column. If we split it row wise, we can think of this as a capability list for each domain. So expounding on this idea of a capability list for domains, if we create the list domain based, we'll have a capability list for each domain. And there again, we can get rid of the empty or sparse entries. And we can simply look at all the objects and the operations that are allowed on top of them. For example, if there is an execute operation M on object OI, so any time that a given process executes, we just look at its capability list. And if we see for object OI in its right set, is M an element of it? So we basically check if M is an element of the right set of object J. Anytime I possess a capability, it means that that access is allowed. So the capability list is of course maintained by the OS. Okay, and so any object or any file pointer would contain another pointer within it, within the data structure to the capability list. And the capability list is per domain. So anytime I make an access, so for a given process or for a given user, my capability list will be checked. And if I have the rights, the access will be allowed, otherwise it won't. Another approach, which is like a compromise between access lists and capability lists, is like this. So recall that an access list is per object and a capability list is either per user or per process, any one of them. So we can have a unique bit pattern called a lock and another list of unique bit patterns called keys. Any process in a domain can only access an object if that specific domain has a key for that object. So what we do is that for every object, instead of maintaining an explicit list, we basically maintain a set of locks with an object. Anytime a domain shows up and it wants to perform some kind of an operation on an object, within the domain we search for a key. So a domain might have a set of keys, right? Essentially we try all the keys on the locks, and let's say one key matches a lock, then it means that we have the access. So the domain can then perform the operation on the object. So of course, the lock and key mechanism can take different amounts of sophistications. So one simple thing is that this could be, let's say the lock could be a large bit vector with zeros and ones. Okay. And the key could simply be its complement. So in this case, all that we do is to check if the key is for a lock, we just take an OR of both of them, a bitwise OR. And if let's say the final value after a bitwise OR is all ones, then we are sure that this is the lock for the key or the key for the lock. This is a slightly sophisticated idea, but it combines the best of both the access list and the capability list. So if we compare the implementations, having a global table is simple, but it can be very large. An access list is great from the point of view of a user. The reason why we say so is like this. Anytime that the user wants to access an object, all that it needs to do is that for the object, it needs to look up the access rights and then basically see if it has the rights or not. So of course we can have the issue of non-localized domains, which basically means that if we have a network system where I have accesses to another machine, but the other machine may not recognize the domain I am from, that will cause somewhat of an issue, but we can always fall back to a default. The only problem is that every access to an object has to be checked. If you have an object with a very intricate set of access rights, it can be slow. Capability lists, on the other hand, are useful for localizing all the information of a given process. So anytime that we actually run a process, what we can do is we can load its capability list into memory and then quickly check if it has access to a given object or not. Of course, revocation capabilities are more difficult in the sense that let's say that I want to maybe ensure that no process has execute access to the object. In the case of an access list, it can be done very easily in the sense that I go to the object and simply take out all the execute permissions. For the capability list based approach, what I need to do is I need to look at the capability lists of all the processes, all the domains registered in the system, and remove this permission from them, which can be quite inefficient. The lock-in key is effective and flexible in the sense keys can be shared, they can be passed freely from domain to domain. It's easy to revoke a permission in the sense we can just change the lock and all the keys will become invalid. So that also is doable. So the lock key method is fairly effective, but of course here the issue can be that if a key is stolen, then pretty much a malicious process has access to the object. So many systems, or I would say most systems, use a combination of both the approaches, an access list and a capability list. First, you access an object, search its access list. If allowed, then a capability is created, which is a data structure, a dynamic data structure. It is created and attached to the process such that for subsequent accesses or additional accesses, nothing needs to be checked. After finishing the last access or after, let's say, while terminating the process, the capability is destroyed. Alright. And this is something that is done in files to a large extent, that the first time we access a file, we actually check its access list. So it is less intricate on Linux and more intricate on Windows. See, if let's say that if the given user or the given domain has access to it, well, that is great. So then we create a capability out of this. This capability is attached to the process. Okay. And given the fact that this capability is attached to the process, what can be done is that for any subsequent access to the file, you don't have to check the access list once again. So this capability is good enough. To revoke access rights, well, there are various options. We can either revoke it immediately or delayed. We can be selective while revoking it or just have a sledgehammer based approach, revoke everything, partial, total, temporary, permanent. With an access list, as we have argued, it is kind of simple because all that we need to do is we need to search the access list, find the entry and remove it. And of course here it can be done immediately. We can either remove it for all the domains or maybe keep it for a few. And furthermore, maybe we can remove it on a temporary basis. So we can say that, look, I am removing it for 1 week, but after 1 week it will get reinstated. In the capability list scheme, revoking a permission is quite hard because we will need to check everything, check the capability lists of all the processes, right, or all the domains. Domain is a more generic term here. So of course we can periodically delete, okay, then we can have back pointers in the sense that we can have a pointer, let's say, from the object to all the capabilities of the object. So these are called back pointers, like in the multic system. Of course, this can be a fairly large set of pointers, but then the key point is that from a given object, we can reach all of its capability lists and then delete the permissions. Or we can have an indirect where a capability list, a CL, points to a global table, right? And in the global table, if we delete something, then it will automatically get deleted in all the capability lists. And of course, the lock-in key method or any extension of that does work over here, in the sense we can have a master key associated with an object. And any time that I would like to access the object, I need to ensure that the master key matches. Anytime I wish to revoke a permission, I can just change the master key, which is nothing but a simple modification of the basic lock and key based approach. Now coming to role based access control, which slightly differs from domain based access control. We can assign users roles and note that a single user can take on multiple roles. So unlike other systems where a given user kind of has a fixed position in the hierarchy of users, in this case the roles can also change. So let's say user can be a manager or can be a senior manager or can be a vice president, and that will enable the user to access a broad set of resources. So this is something that Solaris uses. So for example, the role can be changed via a password such that the same user remains the same, but the role changes. So the user can now access more objects. Kind of similar to an access matrix broadly conceptually. But the key idea, of course, is that what is the capability of a domain that dynamically increases or decreases depending on the role. Then we have some other systems called mandatory access control. So operating systems traditionally have followed what is called discretionary access control, which means that every object has a set of permissions, every user may have a set of capabilities which are dynamically given to it, and they can increase and decrease and so on. But we could have secure versions of an OS, like a secure OS. What the secure OS will do is that it could be hardwired with the access matrix, basically could be hardwired in the sense that every object will have a set of labels and every subject will also have a set of labels, in the sense that it's like a lock and key, but it's like a hardwired lock and key. So whenever the subject requests access to an object, you find whether the labels that the subject holds, like the keys that the subject holds, are compatible with, let's say, the locks that the object holds. And if there is a compatibility, then the subject is allowed to access the object, otherwise it is not. And most of the time these capabilities are not changed during the execution of an operating system. So it's much more hardwired in that sense. So of course a general purpose system cannot be that inflexible, but this idea of a mandatory access control is a reasonable choice for a secure operating system where we don't really expect capabilities, domains and roles to change. Coming to a capability based system, Hydra and CAP, which were like early operating systems, were capability based systems. Linux, Android have some notions of capability, even though they are primarily access list based. So basically what we do is that we do give fine grained control over certain privileged operations by creating bitmaps. So every processor has three kinds of bitmaps: permitted, which means what all it is allowed to do; effective; and inheritable. So this we can apply per process or per thread, and they of course can be revoked and can be reacquired. So what happens is that whenever a process or thread starts, it starts with all privileges, but during its execution, if it doesn't need something, it reduces it. Alright. So essentially the implementation, the principle of the least privilege, this is something what it can do, and then dynamically it reduces itself such that just in case it is taken over by an attacker, it will not be able to do much. Okay. In any POSIX based system, we have some standard system calls to increase or decrease capabilities. So for example, you can say that look, certain network protocols can be used by certain processes, and certain processes cannot use a certain set of network protocols. For example, let's say the ping utility, which is just needed to ping if a machine is alive or not, maybe that is all that I will give to a process. I will not really allow it to communicate any more data on the internet, but all that I'm willing to give it is the ping functionality. So this can be allowed. Furthermore, we can say that I can give it the capability to, let's say, change the ownership of a file as long as the file is not owned by root. Or I can give it the capability to set the UID of a file, in the sense it can create a file making itself the effective user. So let's say this is user A and another user B actually executes this file. The file will run with the permissions of user A. And similarly, other capabilities can be given, whether it can kill a process, whether it can perform network administration, and so on. There are other improvement methods, other improved protection methods. So for example, in Mac OS, there is a very elaborate mechanism to restrict accesses to system files and resources. The key idea is that we extend the file attributes, and we can control things like whether I'm allowed to debug the code or not, because debugging allows you to scrutinize the execution and find out parts of the code, look at the register state, variable state, look at assembly code snippets. So this can be explicitly allowed or disallowed. Furthermore, let's say that if any kernel extension like a kernel module is to be installed, normally operating systems say that it needs to be signed. Signed basically means that we will only trust extensions from, let's say, the vendor. So in this case, maybe for Mac OS, we'll only trust extensions from Apple and nobody else. So in this case, what Apple needs to do is it needs to sign the extension with its private key, such that anybody who is installing the extension can decrypt it with the public key and verify that indeed the extension is from Apple. Similar to firewalls that filter network connections, we can also filter system calls. So this is there in many modified versions of Linux, where you basically say that certain processes can perform certain system calls and certain processors are prohibited from performing a few other system calls. So this idea has been extended in what is called sandboxing, where we run a process in a limited environment or in a controlled environment, and the controlled environment is basically called a sandbox. Okay. So then what the sandbox does is it limits the resources that a process can access. So this is very common in Android. So for example, you say that the process can maybe access the camera, it can access the speaker, but that's all. It can't access any other device. It can't access the printer, for example. So this is kind of leading us towards a virtual machine that basically looks at the program and executes it, not instruction by instruction, but allows the program to execute, but just wraps the system calls and re-implements them. But the key idea of a sandbox is that it essentially traps all the system calls and accesses to devices and then enforces a policy, right? So primarily system calls and hardware device access, and then the sandbox enforces a policy of whether something is to be allowed or not. All right. So then Mac OS X went one step further and basically created what is called the seatbelt feature. This allows you to actually look at the arguments of system calls, allow certain arguments and disallow certain arguments. So there is a language called Scheme, it's a functional language that allows you to create these small code snippets via which you can look at the argument of a system call. Okay. And by looking at these arguments of the system call, you can say that, look, these arguments are allowed in the sense that, so what is a system call? It is asking some service from the kernel, right? So these are the services that are allowed and these are the services that are disallowed. So for example, if this argument is 0 or 1, I have no issue with it, but 2 and 3 I will not allow. So the seatbelt feature further gives the security subsystem much more control over what the application is doing. So we have already discussed code signing. So signing basically verifies that it has been genuinely created by an author. All right. And furthermore, it can also be used to kind of invalidate old programs which are either unsigned or were signed with a different signature, because we are essentially invalidating those signatures. So code signatures is a common way of enforcing the authenticity of the code as well as the integrity of the code. And the integrity is basically sent by like sending a MAC, right? Go back to the security chapter, pretty much like sending a MAC along with the code. So this ensures that number one, the code is authentic, and number two, it has not been tampered with. So then the client system can happily execute the code. Then we can have language based protection. So we can specify in a high level language what are all the policies of the OS that we are going to allow and that we are going to disallow. So we have already discussed an example of this with the seatbelt feature, where basically we have checks at the high level language level for the arguments of system calls. So this can be extended slightly more, in the sense we can have checks for the code, or we can have checks for specific instructions that are sent to sensitive hardware. So of course there is a lot of space over here. In addition, we can have checks over network connections and network packets. So all of this would fall broadly in the domain of language based protection. So coming to Java, so Java is a rather interesting language. The reason being that what we actually run in Java is basically bytecode. Bytecode is written in a virtual ISA, and when we run the code, the bytecode is actually runtime compiled. It's called just-in-time compilation, which means compiling just at runtime. So the just-in-time compilation, what that's going to do is it's going to convert this to x86 code. If running on an x86 machine, that is, it is going to convert it to x86 instructions. And when it converts it to x86 instructions, it executes. So during this process, every method can be scrutinized or inspected to see if it is performing a privileged operation and is that operation safe or not. And furthermore, the stack of arguments can also be inspected at this time as a part of the compilation process to check for safety. Furthermore, Java does allow type safety, in the sense C will happily allow you to typecast, take a float and kind of typecast into an int in an unsafe manner. But Java will not allow all of these, because pretty much what happens is that Java wants to stop you from using pointers. Otherwise, what will happen is that you can access any memory location. Consequently, in Java, pointers are not allowed. Well, pointers are there in the sense that every object is actually represented by its pointer, but user processes are not allowed to manipulate those pointers. And this is where the safety comes from, because if you don't have pointers, you can't access arbitrary memory locations and basically create havoc by reading or writing anything that you want. So this is something that Java explicitly prohibits. And this is also where the notion of type safety comes in, because in C you can happily typecast a pointer to an integer and then do pointer arithmetic on it. This is not something that Java allows. Now coming to the stack inspection. So Java does that in the sense that whenever we are opening, let's say, some remote network site, let's say proxy.lucent.com, and we are checking whether I have permissions to access that or not. All of these things the Java virtual machine can do very well, because it basically has access to all the runtime code that the binary is executing. So doing these additional checks is not difficult at all. So this brings us to an end of chapter 17. So we are finally done with the security and protection aspects of operating systems. So next we will look at virtual machines and distributed computing before we reach the case study.